Every time you hear a crowd disaster make the news, you hear the same two words, stampede and panic. Today's guest has spent 30 years proving that both words are wrong and that they blame the very people who died. The failures that kill people in crowds happen months earlier, in planning meetings, in capacity calculations, and in safety documents that nobody stress tested. Joining us today is Professor G. Keith Still, who has dedicated more than 25 years to understanding how crowds move, how they behave, and above all, how to keep them safe. Keith comes from a mathematical modelling, computer science and operations research. He holds a PhD in crowd dynamics, teaches crowd science at several UK universities, and since 1999 has been a key figure at the UK Cabinet Office Emergency Planning College, where he developed their crowd dynamics and crowd science materials. But Keith is far more from a theoretician. He has worked as a safety advisor on some of the largest and most demanding events on the planet. The 2011 Royal Wedding, the Sydney and London Olympics, the London New Year's Eve fireworks, and the Jumeirah Bridge in Saudi Arabia, a site where up to 3 million pilgrims perform rituals in a single day. And when things go tragically wrong, Keith is who they call. He has acted as an expert witness on high-profile crowd disasters, including the Love Parade tragedy in Germany, and as an advisor to the Hillsborough inquiry. Here is what I find most interesting about Keith. He spent years building highly sophisticated computer simulations of. Then he concluded that expensive software is not what keeps everyday events safe, and now teaches event managers to switch their computer off and use simple, low-cost tools instead of his DIMICE and RAMP models as a site plan and a pencil. He is a Fellow of the Institute of Mathematics and its Applications, a Fellow of the Institute of Civil Protection and Emergency Management, and a Specialist Fellow in the International Institute of Risk and Safety Management. Please welcome the author of Introduction to Crowd Science, Dr. Keith Still. So, welcome. Sorry for that long introduction, Keith. So, just the first sort of question, before we get into the tools and the guidance documents, I want to start with the discipline itself, because I think most of our listeners have never heard the phrase crowd science before this show. So, the first question, for someone who thinks a crowd is just a lot of people in one place, how would you describe crowd science?
Yeah, I mean, it's the how, why, where, and when crowds form and move. So there's a combination of mathematics and psychology. I was once called into a radio program, and they wanted to put myself and a psychologist against each other to try and define, is a crowd psychological or is it physical? And there's a threshold. Below one person per square meter, people are influenced more by their surroundings. If you're walking in a park, for instance, it's what you see in the distance that may influence your movement. But as the crowd density starts to increase, as you get more and more people per square meter, it starts to take on a more physical form. So crowd science is this combination of maths and psychology, and the threshold there is around about one person per square meter. So it's a combination of understanding movement, density, flow, psychology in terms of the behavior. And unlike other psychologists that maybe study a crowd and try to figure out why they did something, we look at what we need to do to influence the crowd to do the right thing. So signage, information, design systems, how you manage a crowd, how you present yourself to a crowd. For instance, a security guard with a military look may well elicit a type of response from a crowd, where somebody that's dressed in a more pastel color with the word safety on them may influence them differently. So it's about psychology, it's about behavior, it's about managing the crowd, but understanding those thresholds. At what point does the crowd become more physics-oriented, but density and flow are related? At what point does it become more psychologically influenced? At what point does it reach critical threshold where crush density might occur? So really it's this combination of maths and psychology. around about 70% influencing behaviour and 30% understanding those thresholds.
Mm, interesting. Yeah. And one thing is that when something goes wrong in a crowd, the word used is panic, isn't it? But you spent a career pushing back on that word. So what actually happens inside a dense crowd when things go wrong?
Well, first and foremost, I think one of the quotes that's attributed to me over the years is that people don't die because they panic. They panic because they're dying. So it's one of our last responses. And panic is generally shutting down of the senses, not understanding what to do next, a rabbit caught in a headlight. But running away from a threat is a perfectly natural response, a fight or flight syndrome. So as crowd density builds up, and as you start to find yourself caught in confined spaces or caught within a crowd, you're now desperately trying to get out. So crowd reaction, crowd behavior there starts to take on a fight or flight syndrome. But that's after the risks already manifest. So understanding that risk. As the crowd reaches a threshold where people have a difficulty in breathing, then of course they're starting to push and shove to get out of the way. So it's a natural reaction, a fight or flight syndrome. It's not panic. Panic would be the irrational response to a set of stimuli. And getting away from a threat is a perfectly rational response. The other phrase that's often used is stampede. But if you look at things like Love Parade, 801 disaster, Hillsborough, most of the other major disasters, when the press are using the word stampede, it implies the crowd have got space to run. But a progressive crowd collapse, a crowd crush, is they've not got the space to breathe. So majority of people that die in crowd crushes are dying through compressive or restrictive asphyxia, pressure on the rib cage, preventing people breathing. It's nothing to do with panic. It's nothing to do with stampede. It's a failure to understand that threshold where the volume of people exceeds the safe capacity of a site. So if I have a 100 square meters area, then there's a threshold at which I can put people in that. Once I exceed that threshold, they're at risk of a compressive or restrictive asphyxia. And generally we say once you understand your area, once you could do the calculation, once you understand what that threshold is, that at 80% of that maximum value, that's when you should start controlling crowd flow into those areas. It's in an area or even a street, once the volume of people exceed the safe capacity of the flow down that street, then you're into a critical situation. So failing to understand the volume of people and the capacity of your site is fundamental to these things. Once people are in that environment, they're at risk.
So you talk about, well, the industry talks about 5 people to a square meter. Then when that starts to increase, you've explained it a little bit, but what sort of happens when you move from like 5 people per square meter to then say 6.5, for instance?
Well, we did the experiment in classrooms where we actually mark out a square meter on the ground. You put 2, 3, 4, 5. Once you get up to that 5, there's still a bit of space between people. But you go up to 6 people per square meter and they're now in physical contact, which means that any small movement on the outside can amplify and start to cascade through the crowd. So you get this effect like dominoes. If people in close contact, first their feet get closer together. So the center of gravity, the balance starts to, it's like, the kid's toy, weebles wobble, but they don't fall down, was the old phrase. Well, you get that sort of experiment in classrooms where we actually mark out a square meter on the ground. You put 2, 3, 4, 5. Once you get up to that 5, there's still a bit of space between people. But you go up to 6 people per square meter and they're now in physical contact, which means that any small movement on the outside can amplify and start to cascade through the crowd. So you get this effect like dominoes. If people in close contact, first their feet get closer together. So the center of gravity, the balance starts to, it's like, The kids' toy, Weebles wobble, but they don't fall down, was the old phrase. Well, you get that sort of inverted 10 pin. It's not got a stable configuration, and therefore any movement, and people start to stagger and move against each other. It's not got a stable configuration, and therefore any movement, and people start to stagger and move against each other. The second element that comes into play is psychologically, once you're confined, you're trying to find a way out. You're starting to feel the claustrophobic effect of crowds around you. 7, 8 people per square meter, it just amplifies from that point onwards. So once you reach that 5 people per square meter, you still have enough space, assuming that everybody's a sort of average build. Obviously, if it's children, you might have a higher density, or different countries. India, for instance, has a smaller body frame, so it has a higher threshold. But again, it's that physical contact. We call it the packing coefficient. Once people are packed so that they're touching, that's the point at which you then have those psychological and physical thresholds kicking in. Below that, it's reasonably safe because people feel they've got space to move. So again, it's the psychological limit plus the physical limit. When those two start to reach that critical threshold of 5 people per square meter, that's when the effects start to amplify and people feel constrained, and therefore will start to react.
Yeah, excellent, yeah. And I don't know, one thing that I've particularly observed is certainly since COVID, people seem to be struggling a lot more with anxiety, don't they? Even just going out shopping or things like that, there's seems to be an increased risk of people with anxiety. So that's only going to affect the modelling, isn't it?
Well, yeah, I mean, we factor that in. In fact, one thing that we've seen in certain environments is a sense of entitlement. People have been, during COVID, you switch on Netflix and you've got instant gratification. You go to an event and there's queuing, there's merchandising, there's toilets, there's things to do. You have to physically move around, and you have waits. So that level of sense of entitlement of, I've paid my money, I should be able to have it instantly,
Right.
starts to kick into. And we saw a distinct behavioural change on that still seems to be, prevalent a couple of years after COVID shut down. And it seems to be a sort of psychological element within crowds. And again, you factor that into your thinking. How might this crowd respond? And if you increase the information, telling people how long the wait is, what's happening, it can reduce that level of anxiety. So how we inform the crowd is a vital element to keep them safe, keep them informed, and keep them behaved.
Interesting. Yeah, fascinating. So I think we're kind of building a bit of a picture as to how these questions are going to go, because you came to this field as a modeler. You built some of the most sophisticated crowd simulations in the world, which makes your current position all the more striking. So to ask you about that then, you spent decades developing computer simulations for crowds, and yet in your book you tell people to turn the computer off, get out a site plan, and use paper and coloured pencils. So why did you walk away from this expensive software, and what makes a simple line drawing a better tool for a crowd manager, for instance?
Well, you answered the question there when you posed it. Expensive software.
Right.
Some of these sophisticated tools require a lot of knowledge of computer software and simulations. Require a lot of modelling to put in the various parameters that's set there. And whereas somebody like myself, who spent decades studying behaviour and movement and crowds and different cultures, I find it relatively easy to program those parameters and to turn the psychological model into a set of parameters to feed into a computer program. The old phrase, garbage in, garbage out. Well, if you don't know how to do that, how can you trust the output? So what I realized is that in all essence, there were things that I was seeing in the computer simulation that didn't need a computer after I'd found that relationship anymore. You didn't need it anymore. You could understand if you put, for instance, a lot of people program intelligence into agents. Well, crowds are not necessarily that smart. I mean, you've walked through many environments where you're thinking, why are people going that way? What's influencing in those elements? And those are all the things you need to program in, that level of sophistication. Whereas if you look at a map, plan, or a diagram, you can say, I need to put signage here, here, and here in order to tell the crowd to move this way. and the signage needs to be high enough and visible enough. All of that difficult to code into a computer simulation, but easy if you know the simple rules.
Yeah.
What are lines of sight? At what point does density start to affect crowd behavior? How do people know where to go? And that's down to signage and information. So I realized that out of all of the years of building sophisticated modeling tools, there were a simple set of rules. And if I could teach those rules, then, in the front line, where maybe you don't have access to computers, but if you understand what the rules are, what the models are, the fundamentals of it, then you can keep crowds safe. So, for instance, we did years and years of research into the disasters, the fundamental causality from a legal perspective, and distill that into a dim ice model. So you look at any section of a site and you say, what's the design, what's its limits, what information's available, and how do we manage the crowd in those spaces? What about ingress, circulation, and egress, dim ice? And then under both normal and emergency conditions, that's the three fundamental distal causes: design failure, information failure, or management failure. And it happens during ingress, circulation, and egress. So if you understand that, then you can look at your site and say, how do we keep this area safe? So those rules can be distilled into a matrix in analyzing your environment, and then color coding it: green, amber, and red. Green is stuff that we think we do well and therefore never need to scrutinize. Amber are things that we might need to improve for the future. And red are things that we've definitely got to, fix now. So, when you go to, it's okay, we need monitoring, or we need to fix it. And again, it's simple sets of rules that can be applied to any built and complex environment in order to keep it safe. So really, it was distillation of modeling, simulation, years of research. That was my PhD, basically. Years of research into the underlying causality. And then how do we turn that into simple sets of rules and training and instructions so that your crowd manager on the front line, who maybe doesn't have access to sophisticated computer programs, or even the knowledge and experience to program or code that, how do we turn it into tools that they can use that can keep crowds safe? So really that was the flip side of the work, as I discovered how to do it and then started to develop teaching programs. So when I started teaching at the Cabinet Office back in 1999, the Emergency Planning College, I came in with a PhD up at this level, and I realized that everybody else was talking about at ground level, what do we need to know to keep this crowd safe? So I had to come all the way down and think about, how do I take what I know and turn it into teaching methodologies? So dim ice, crowd dynamics, density and flow, ramp analysis, routes, areas, movement profile, break it down into the risks, break it down into the dynamics models, break it down into analyze how crowds can develop into high density environments, look at risk and congestion mapping, which is color coding maps by time. So what's the congestion during ingress? What's the congestion mid-event? What's the congestion during egress? And then a decision support tool. How do I put that together in order to determine my strategy and tactics? So that was so successful that many of the tools and models are now in UK, European, and Australian guidance, and coupled with the work that we're doing out in the Middle East. It's been so successful that it's mandatory training for all UK public event commanders. And I have, for the last 8 years, been teaching 100 police officers at a time, 4 or 5 times a year in India, just to understand how to apply science to an environment, to a culture. So when I did the work out in Saudi Arabia, I was an 11 years special advisor to the Saudi government for Hajj projects, for the Jamra Bridge, 3 million people per day, same rules. Whether it's 500 people queuing at a nightclub or 3 million people per day in complex religious festivals and mass gatherings, it's the same rules.
Right.
The risks are the same. Once density, exposure to high density reaches a certain level, then the risks start to rise exponentially. Now, the simple way to explain it is, think of it like a tachometer on a car. There's a red line. Well, what happens if you rev your engine in the red line, beyond the red line? Something's got to go. It's the same with a crowd. If you understand what that red line is, whether it's density or flow or volume and capacity, whether it's a queuing system, whether it's a behavioral change, if you understand where those red lines are, keeping it below the red line keeps it relatively safe. So it's understanding how to apply this red line model to built and complex environments so that during design, during planning phases, if you know how to apply the rules, you know how to keep that crowd safe.
Interesting. Yeah. I think one of the most memorable things that I picked up from a training session that I did, we were at a venue simulating an evacuation, and it was a round building with doors all the way around the perimeter, so you could evacuate, 2,000 people in seconds, really. But
Sorry.
we were told that crowds will try and exit the way they came in because they're familiar with that. So there's all of us stewards being trained, and then they triggered an evacuation, and I watched all of us go to the main entrance when all the exterior doors have been flung open. And I just thought, we're kind of experts here, and we're still doing it wrong. And it was only when the steward started saying this way, and directing the crowd through the nearest exit. So that really stuck with me. And I suppose that goes back to what you were saying about simple rules, understanding the basic rules of human behaviour.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that can be explained in what's called the Ellsberg's paradox. And I can give you an illustration. Imagine a red ball, black ball game. In this hand, I have a bucket. There's 500 red balls, 500 black balls, so 50-50. In this hand, I've got a bucket, same weight, same size, 1,000 balls in there, but I don't know what that mix is. Could be all red, could it be all black? Now, can you afford to lose £5,000?
No.
No? Okay, well, let's play for £10,000. Let's make it interesting. If you pick a red ball, I'll give you £10,000. If you pick a black ball, you have to give me £10,000. Now, you've got a choice of these two buckets, 50-50 or the unknown percentage. So which bucket do you choose?
50-50 I'd go for.
Okay, now mathematically they're identical, but that's not how the human mind works.
Right.
What we look at is what we feel is a known risk against the unknown risk.
Right.
And that's why people go out the way they came in. I know where that exit goes.
Yeah.
I've got no idea where these other exits lead to. It could be into more danger. I don't know.
Yeah.
So you go out the way you came in because it's that familiarity. And it can be negated if you've got the steward saying, this way to safety. Now I've changed the information in the environment. I've told you, for instance, this unknown mix is mostly black. So I've changed the information, and therefore I've changed your perception, your decision-making on it. And that's how the psychology influences crowd behavior. So it's that information at the critical point, steward shouting this way to safety will change that behavior of that crowd. Because otherwise, all they know is I'm going to take what I perceive to be the lesser risk. By the way, you lost. You owe me 10 grand.
Excellent. Thinking a little bit about venues, and how they can implement some of these things. They'll often go to a consultant, and some of the people that listen to this podcast are consultants, and they will use simulations, won't they, to sort of prove that the system works rather than test how it fails. So how much false confidence would you say has been put into that habit into the events industry? Relying on this software.
I know of 2 major disasters where the simulation showed that it worked and it was safe. So that's why I balk against simulations and models, because unless you know how to test a system and test the thresholds of failure, then all you're doing is producing an animation of this is what it'll look like if everything goes right. So I'd always programmed dumb people doing dumb things in order to see what was the worst case scenario. And then realizing once I'd figured out what the worst case scenario is, what do I need to do to keep it safe? So when people see simulations and models, they're generally being presented on the basis, I get paid a lot of money and I don't want the client to see something that fails. So, I want the client to be reassured that everything's going to be fine. And of course, that's where the sales pitch and the simulation and recouping your expenses on these expensive simulations, that's where it starts to fail. is that you want to show the best result because you want the client to pay at the end of it for everything's working. Now, unfortunately, again, that's where you need to understand human behavior, psychology, how to code the mathematics behind the models and simulations. And I often said that if you're presented with a crowd simulation, just ask the guy that's coded it, okay, what were your rules? What did you code into this? At what point will this system fail?
Mm,
And the faster their jaw hits the ground, the less confidence you should have in their input and analysis.
right.
So take everything with a pinch of salt. I've been called into several major events where the simulation showed everything was right, but the security staff were saying, "No, I'm not comfortable with this because that's not how real crowds move in that environment." And what happens if something say changes the weather conditions? How have you programmed that? What happens if, I've got somebody behaving in a rather odd and curious way? How would the crowd respond to that? What happens if I got a transport delay? What happens if I've got a stop and search procedure that changes? What happens if somebody comes into that environment and starts to look as if he's, behaving in an odd way or with malicious intent? What happens if I've got a bad smell? How might the crowd respond to that? One classic example, I noticed somebody quoted me over the weekend. We had a tunnel in Leeds, Leeds United, where all of a sudden there was this massive crowd congestion. And the reason for that was that just before the end of the event, the police horses came through the tunnel and left a rather large deposit,
Yeah,
which of course meant there was a huge smell and stuff that was on the ground that you needed to avoid. I'll use the word stuff. So obviously, that changes behaviour. So how does that factor in? Now, all of these are odd little anomalies you need to code in. In other words, dumb people doing dumb things rather than clever people always avoiding risks, and therefore your system's never going to show any of the dangers that might be involved in large, complex, crowded spaces. So again, unless you're programming all that in, all you get out is a very positive result that all looks
yeah,
shiny and glowing. And that's
yeah,
an animation rather than a simulation of potential failure.
yeah. Yeah, it was us that posted that, your quote on that. I think we
Was it?
well, yeah. We even did a picture of them navigating around this, deposit that the horse had left as well, so
Apologies. I mean, I
it
got
was great.
sent articles and details all the time, and it was fascinating to see that because, of course, that's what happened at Leeds. Large deposit, crowd behaviour, and there was quite a significant crowd crush developing until we realised what had happened, and therefore we could then put some teams down there to just inform people. Say, if you just hold a couple of minutes, it's going to be a bit slow ahead. A horse has left a deposit. So again, it's easy to fix if you know what's gone wrong, but that would never show up in a simulation unless you coded it.
No. So this is a little bit of a trickier one then. So if the licensing authority turns up to check on the event's plans, and they're shown this rather smooth simulation of an evacuation, what should the governing authorities really be asking? What should they be really wanting to see demonstrated? Because the venue won't want to show them a bit of baking paper, will they, with some lines on it? There's so where do they kind
Actually,
of
you'd be surprised because we teach people how to incorporate that into your license submission.
right?
So if you've got and again, we teach licensing officers to look out for this. It's very difficult for AI to create a realistic site plan or site image. So it demonstrates that somebody has put some genuine thinking into it. I can produce a document and a risk assessment on AI, and the licensing officers would never know because they're now, that good. However, the diagrams, things like flow diagrams, ingress and egress, a demise model, these things are very difficult for AI to produce accurately. And therefore, you can see here and sense the human hand, the thinking that's gone behind it. And therefore, we've got a method where the Institute of Licensing can say, if I've got evidence that there are site diagrams within my license submission, I should feel that much more confidence that there's a competent person drawing it up. And this is a huge difference between experience and competence. As you probably know, anybody out there that drives, there's a lot of experienced drivers out there, but not really that many competent drivers that fully understand the rules of the road and, give way and thinking ahead. It's the same with crowd managers. There's a lot of experience out there. And if you take Astroworld, where 10 kids died, in that I was an expert witness. If you want to see the report, Keith Still, Astroworld, Google that and you can get my expert report on it. It was published by the Houston Chronicle. And what you had there were a lot of people that had experience in events, but didn't know how to apply the fundamentals. So within their reports, they had the line diagrams, just didn't think it through, didn't apply it to crowd movement. They knew what the principles had set were, but because they had been formally trained in it, they didn't complete that modelling scenario. So again, insufficient documents, training licence officers what to look for, training police officers in order that when they're involved safety advisory groups in the UK, they can ask that questions. What if everybody goes out the way they came in? What if we've got malicious intent? How might the crowd react? What's your plan for it? And that really helps improve catching those plans that might not be competent but may well be experienced, and then just pushing on higher up that chain of safety understanding by applying crowd science.
Yeah. Interesting. This isn't this we didn't discuss about this, but I've just had a thought really. So as you know, our SafetyDocs platform, a lot of events use our app to store live plans and data. And just a question, because some people like flowcharts, other people don't like flowcharts, But thinking about what you've described about what if, do you what is for the guy on the ground, that's at an event and they're asked that question, what if? What's a good way to present that from like an event manager's point of view? Do you agree with flowcharts or?
I certainly do, and people. We teach 3 different methods for risk analysis. Do it numerically, do it by a written description, do it by a diagram. A flowchart, for instance, will help fundamental understanding, but not everybody sees things in the same way. So
Right.
do it all 3.
Yeah, right.
And therefore, whoever's reading it can see a numerical analysis, can see a written analysis, can see a diagram analysis. And therefore, whichever one is their mindset, be able to pick it up that way around. Now, I've seen and I've taught. We did a calculation of over 10,000 people. I think I've got 4,000 learners online at the moment. So over the last 25, 30 years or so, one of the comments that come back is, this is so simple. I can not only apply it, but I can explain it to a client in a diagram. The phrase, a picture's worth 1,000 words. And what I like most about SafetyDocs is that ability to take the best way of presenting information and keep that consistent.
Yeah.
So that when people come to a site, a different security company going to the same site, they've got a template that works for that site rather than, we did this at one football stadium and therefore that should be how we apply it to all football stadium. As you know, different ingress, egress routes, different geometry, different nomenclature of north exit, Preston side, east side, all of the phrases there that are unique to the site need to be maintained within the site. But you've got somebody that's got experience with that site, then leaves the job. You don't want that knowledge going with them.
Yeah.
You want to capture it, and that's where I really like SafetyDocs as a concept, is that it's site-specific. It's, it's venue-specific. It means that people then have to learn how to communicate in that venue's language, and that knowledge is caught and captured. Now, that's what I do with modelling, is that I take the event-specific details and turn it from what's known as tacit information that we know from experience, and turn it into codified information. So how do I turn it into a form that other people can pick up, understand, and utilize? And I think we've had some fascinating discussions, David, about how we can utilize that modeling technique and incorporate into SafetyDocs to give it, a more coherent alliance between the teaching and training principles and the documentation element of it. So it's a very exciting opportunity to be working with you on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny, only a couple of weeks ago, we were actually walking our evacuation route at Leeds Arena that we had a venue at. In our evacuation plan, one of so we have an ERT, so Emergency Response Team North, and one for the South. Emergency team split because you don't know quite where the evacuation will be. Well, the rule described going through the building and out through a particular door. That was the easiest way to the muster point. As we're walking it, we're saying, hang on, this is during an evacuation. These corridors are going to be full of people. So we can't take this route, to the muster point. So we changed the documentation that we would actually leave the building at the main door and walk around the outside. Well, so we changed the documentation. It instantly synced to all the departments, for that. So I think you've touched on that. Having live documentation, not a static PDF that is a nightmare to update and multiple versions.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But just getting into the next sort of section, we kind of live in SafetyDocs. We kind of live at the moment because that's the options: purple guide, green guide, the e-guide, and then of course the HSE documents. So those sort of documents are all we've got to sort of check documentation and things like that. Now you've not always been positive about these guides, and I get a lot of we spot a lot of inconsistencies, believe it or not. But the UK guidance often quotes a capacity of 2 people per square metre, but you argue that number is dangerously oversimplified because it fails to distinguish between a static crowd and a moving one. So what happens when an organiser applies that figure blindly to a crowd that's moving?
You put the crowd at risk. So basically, you split the space into static and dynamic. Now, I'm currently working with various government agencies on updating guidance. But what you need to understand is that guidance and legislation, so things like a statutory instrument like the building code, will define density and flow, but that's not necessarily the same thing that's in guidance. So you can get prosecuted by failing to observe the building codes, but it could still be guidance compliant. And one example would be, say, the Green Guide to Safety at Sports Ground. Excellent document, and it does highlight at the start, used by a competent person, you need other understanding, etc. But you just pick it up and you read through it, and it says 4 people per square metre for queuing areas in and around buildings. Now, the statutory instrument, the building code, says 1.7 people per square metre. So immediately inconsistency. Now, we've advised on various buildings and sites in it and said, if you know you're going to exceed the statutory limits for the building code, then you need to put additional safety measures into place to mitigate that risk. So you've recognized the risks, you're mitigating the risk. You realize that, for instance, a stadium that might have hoarding around it for remedial work or building or construction work might then expose that crowd to a higher density, higher flow during egress. But if you've got monitoring and crowd management on standby for it, you're exposing that crowd to that higher risk for a short duration, and it's monitored, and you've got a safety or contingency plan in place, then that stands up in a court of law of taking all reasonable precautions. If you don't do that, you've exceeded the safety limits, and therefore you can get prosecuted under the Health and Safety at Work Act, Occupiers Liability Act, and the building code would be the thing that people would use to say you've exceeded the safe limits. So understanding what the difference between legal requirements and what would be guidance requirements, it's great stuff, but you need to, be a lot more competent than just to say, well, the Green Guide says 4, therefore we can have 4.
Yeah.
Under what circumstances is that permissible? At what point does that steadily break down? Even things like you read the Green Guide, it says 8 minutes evacuation time. That's what people think. I should be able to evacuate a stadium in 8 minutes. No. What the Green Guide says is 8 minutes for people to get to a free-flowing corridor, an area where they can continue to move without restrictions. So that could be getting from your seat to the concourse area. It doesn't necessarily mean to evacuate the building. So you've got to be precise about how you're reading and applying the guidance. And that's why in the Guide to Safety at Sports Ground and the event guide, it talks about competent use of the material, a competent person. And back to our driving analogy, there are a lot of experienced drivers out there, but not necessarily a lot of competent drivers. So competency here comes down to education, training, qualifications.
Yeah. Interesting. So, talking about the sort of crowd risk analysis at the minute, I mean, it's hard work for event organisers when they're putting together their operational plan. They're going to have lots of documents in there. So, safety plan, emergency plan, the event-wide risk assessment, the list goes on and on, doesn't it? And then now with Martyn's Law, there's going to be hostile vehicle mitigation. There's going to be a whole raft of, what if in situations. The crowd risk analysis kind of stretches through all those documents, doesn't it? There's going to be elements of crowd risk in every one of those. When you've looked at documentation that's been submitted, certainly on these inquiries where things have gone wrong, what are kind of the red flags for you that show they've not really done a proper crowd risk analysis?
Evidence of cut and paste, inconsistency in fonts, inconsistency in use in language, things that are generic that come straight out the health and safety executive's website. Things such as generic trip, slip and falls. Like a high proportion of accidents and incidents are a result of a trip, slip and fall in a crowd. So if you just say trip, slips and falls, high risk about that, but then don't specify at what location might the trip, slips and falls be higher, an entry point, an exit point, during entry and exit. But therefore, that's a short duration high risk event that should be recognized and identified in a risk assessment, not just trip, slips and falls across the site.
Right.
So specifying where a trip, slip and fall might be, and trip, slips and falls, one of the first things I look for is that, being one of the highest percentage, I forget what the actual statistics are, but if you Google it, the number of accidents and incidents that are a result of a trip, slip and fall in a crowd, that can then result in a progressive crowd collapse, but only at entry and exit points during entry and exit. So unless a risk assessment specifies that, it's just a generic cut and paste from the health and safety executive. Also the structure of a document. If it flits around the risk assessment from section to section, but if it's coherent, ingress, here are risks associated with ingress. Circulation, here are risks associated with circulation. Egress, then I see a different structure to what the cut and paste from government guidance is, and I see somebody actually then thinking about it and applying it to that specific site. So the structure of your risk assessment is important, and again, that's one of the beauties about AI is that it gives you a very generic format. If you start to look at, okay, how structured is this risk assessment? How much information is put in there? What site-specific details are in there? Then, when I do expert witness, it's usually crowd management plan, risk assessment are the first two documents to assess. Did they fully understand the risks at that site? Have they structured the risk assessment to be specific to that site? And again, that's where SafetyDocs is such a huge advantage. You can take site-specific information and say, here are risks known to the specific site. What are you doing to mitigate those risks?
Yeah.
So, you give yourself a template which is more site-specific and more structured, and now people have to think about filling the form in rather than just cutting and pasting from other elements.
Yeah. That's good. So you'd like to sort of see there could be a risk assessment for slips and trips, but that could be by the concession booth, which if somebody's slipped there, probably not a big problem. But if somebody slipped by the exit during egress, that's a big risk that needs to be identified in the document.
And if it's not differentiated in your risk assessment, then somebody hasn't thought it through, hasn't, a generic application. I'm dealing with a case just now, which is exactly that. Generic trip, slips and falls, which uses exactly the words for the HSE guidance template. It talks about kitchens for an outdoor event. So it talks about slips, trips and falls in kitchens. And I'm going, there are no kitchens at this event. This is an outdoor event. This is catering tents, and therefore the language is inconsistent with the actual site. And sure enough, it's a subcontracted standard template for all events rather than a specific template to that event site. And that's where, your SafetyDocs is so unique in the feature is, look, here's a template that is for our site.
Yeah.
You need to now think about how you're going to manage those risks for our site. So any subcontractor coming in now has a site-specific template that you've thought through, modified and enhanced, rather than coming in with their own risk assessment, which might be generic from somewhere else. So SafetyDocs has this huge advantage of being able to capture and codify all of that information, that experience, and then turn it into a competency document rather than just a generic application of a risk assessment.
Yeah. One major obstacle, that we're facing with that is you'll go for a site tour of a venue, and you'll say, what can we see your documentation? Can we see your evacuation route or your muster points? Oh no, we can't give you that. That's well, hang on. We're here to do a site risk evaluation, to produce the documents that are site specific and venue specific, and yet you're not even giving us any information, and that's surprisingly common.
I mean, I've done it for more venues than I'd care to mention, is where we do what would happen if you got litigation. You want us to do a competency check of your documentation, sign the various non-disclosure agreements. Obviously, I can't talk about who was involved in that, but then going through a review, doing a site survey, a site visit, and saying, you realise you are now exposed to the following risks because you haven't mentioned them in your documentation. So I approach it from a point of view of saying, it's like an insurance policy. If you've got somebody like me checking it, then if there's, and you comply with what we've stated in our response, then in the event of litigation, I have to be defending that. So I'll often get called in because they don't want me on the prosecution side of things, or the plaintiff side of it. They say, well, if we can get our documentation right and it's been checked by an expert, therefore we're that much safer if an accident occurs, to demonstrate clearly not only have we thought it through, we've had somebody review our documentation and improve the process procedures.
Yeah.
So, safety is like insurance.
Yeah.
You need to invest in it because if something does go wrong, it's your insurance policy that takes the brunt of that. So reasonable care, reasonable precautions, a higher level of documentation. The unfortunate thing is, as you know, is that there's no profit in the documentation. It doesn't make money.
Exactly.
So you need to think of it like an insurance policy.
Yeah.
You have to pay that out because you're paying it out for if something goes wrong. So reasonable care, reasonable precautions, adherence to standard operational practices, making sure that guidance and documentation, like including Martyn's Law, is all up to date and up to code, and then being specific about that site's nomenclature for trip, slips and falls and location, duration, severity. So that's the huge difference between, an experienced individual drawing it up rather than a competent person. And because there's no profit in it, it generally tends to get, the least path of resistance. If I can cut and paste from previous documents and I can do it quickly, and if I don't need to think about it, then it hasn't lost me money. And that's the wrong attitude in safety. Now, you look at events and compare it to any other safety-related industry, like if it's a near miss or a close call, what happens? Team of experts go out, a new process procedures drawn up. They've got legal experts, they'll have aviation experts, they'll have pilots, all reviewing what that near miss was in order to put in a new process procedure to prevent it from happening again. Near miss and close call in the events industry, nobody talks about it. I'm not about to advertise I had 6 close calls last year. It's not good promotion. It's not good marketing. So it's the documentation that really should be embedding that information in and, learning from other people's mistakes. I think that the common phrase is, it's a wise man that learns from his mistakes. It's a wiser man that learns from the mistakes of others. So how do we capture that knowledge and information in order to keep our environment safe. And that's where training process procedures come into play.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. No, it's very true, is that? And, you've got to think of the people turning up to these events as well, exhibitors, for instance, and they're thinking about setting the stand up. Are they going to make any money? And, getting where they're going to stay and all these things. These are all the main things, and safety is like at the bottom of the list, really. And they'll often start thinking about it a day or two before the event. So it's kind of just a bit of a re-education. Thinking about Martyn's Law now, because I think there's a lot of talk about it in there when a good venue has been doing complying anyway for a long time. But I think the big difference is, and I don't know if you agree with this, is what will change is the fact that the SIA or other bodies can turn up at an event and either say, show us your documentation, your processes. We don't think you're running a safe event, so we're going to stop it. That's probably the biggest risk, the embarrassment, of all that and the loss of credibility. But then there are the fines, and people are saying, up to 18 million, but that's probably very unlikely that those sorts of fines will go out unless people are persistent. So it's going to come, the documentation is going to be under more scrutiny, isn't it? Is that how you see Martyn's Law?
Well, two things. It's one that in the event of an emergency, it's communication that's key. How do we communicate with the crowd? And unfortunately, things like a fire bell just doesn't cut it. If I need to get people to move and to move that way, I need to communicate that to it. So again, it's that lack of thinking through an emergency scenario. Documentation. I mean, I've been involved in risk assessments from small to very large events, and it's essential to consider documentation as part of the training process. So what we'll find is that if you've got to document Martyn's Law in a particular way, as we know, if that's then going to be checked by independent authorities, the SIA, for instance, as we know, then that's just part of the process. I still need to turn that into an actionable plan. So having a document that passes scrutiny as opposed to having a process and procedure that is safe in the built and complex environment are two very different things. So, documentation is the starting point, but then teaching, training, education, communication with the crowd in emergency, that's the things that then follow on from the documentation. So unless you've got a solid, stable base there, the rest of it is got to be built on that foundation. So your documents, your guidance, your details is the start of the process. Teaching, training, education, and forwarding. I mean, we have a choir. My wife and a good friend of ours are the musical directors. Wife's the conductress, and we have a process procedure. We've got elderly people in the choir. We've got people that are not as mobile. Whenever we get to make provision for it, we went and inspected the stage. It's the village stage. I went along and I said, look, we need footers on that. We need to be visible because it's going to be dark. Those banisters need to be replaced to be stable because we've got people that have got lesser mobility impairment. And in the event of an emergency, we can't have those people on stage because they'll then not be able to get off. We start all of our, just like 100 people in the audience, but have we got sufficient fire exits? Are they all clear? That's my job to go and check that. And that's just a small venue. Now, we don't fall under Martyn's Law because we're less than 800 people, but we still take the process and procedures very seriously. Why? Because they're our friends and neighbours. If anything were to go wrong in the unlikely event, I need to be able to stand up in the court of law and say we took all reasonable care, reasonable precautions. So that's the seriousness of your safety manager. And unfortunately, there's a lot of people in the safety industry that have the same attitude. I want to make sure that my venue, my event is as safe as possible. But we don't have the competency that can then think that through to all of its dimensions. And when you start adding Martyn's Law in, well, there's a whole bunch of new stuff I now need to think about and learn and study and understand. And one of the biggest elements of that is communicating with the crowd. I mean, even back to our simple example, if we got loss of power during the summer, not so much a problem. because it's light and people can see the exits. During the winter, yeah, that could be a little bit more serious. So what's our emergency lighting? What's our backup plan? But more importantly, that power might come back on. We've a number of power outages here that are only for a couple of minutes. So what's our contingency plan? Okay, the choir goes into a cappella mode. We keep singing, we keep performing. Sorry, the lights are out because we've lost our amplifiers, we've lost our keyboard, we've lost all the power to everything that's musical instruments. We just have a choir on the stage. We've lost the lighting, we've lost everything. What we don't want is people to suddenly react to that. So announcement from front in a very loud and clear voice. Right, if there's a power outage, if the lights go out, we will continue in a cappella until we can figure out what the situation is and come up with our, contingency plan for it. But the most important thing is to keep that crowd calm until we've evaluated what the risks are.
Yeah.
We've had outages here that are just transient, but things need to be reset.
Yeah.
Things need to be switched back on again. So what's our contingency plan to keep that crowd informed and calm while we're processing things? Because what we don't want is somebody to suddenly jump up, start running for an exit, start tripping over people, and then we've got a less of a manageable situation. I'm not going to use the word stampede or panic. People are responding to that threat. So if they're warned about it in advance, if they know there's a contingency plan to play it and the choir are rehearsed on that plan, then we're not going to have a problem. So again, it's understanding what does Martyn's Law mean for my crowd communication, my communication strategy, my documentation, my, sudden and unexpected check on that, my licensing application. That's where we see, we're organizations like yourself with SafetyDocs really comes to the fore, because you can think that through for venues and you can provide guidance for those subcontractors that are coming in to operate within that site.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier about the cut and paste mentality and risk assessments and things. There's going to be a lot more people having to do assessments from under Martyn's Law when you think of big weddings, big funerals, there are more than 800 people, a lot more organizations will be coming into that. Do you think that Martyn's Law could become like the biggest cut and paste exercise the industry's ever seen?
Interesting. I think there are certainly, like yourself, you're providing a template that's event specific. They then have to fill in that information to a compliant form. That's not cut and paste. So, but if you are looking at something where you have to do it and you've got no template to work from, then there's a higher risk of thinking, okay, what's the quickest way I can get this done? Because I've got to get up to the license application. I've got to, by law, put in a risk assessment. So what's the quickest way I can do that? So without that compliant format, without the background and training, yes, I think there is a huge risk of cut and paste. And unfortunately, I think possibly, fortunately, we're still in a situation where that's a very low level element of risk to it. It needs to be done in order to protect people from harm. But, the MEN type bombing, which led to Martyn's Law, it's not something that happens at every venue every day. So, again, be proportional in your assessment of risk. I know what I need to do for my local choir with 100 villagers. It's not the same as that I would do for Hajj with 3 million people. It's not the same that I would do for a major venue where I've got maybe controversial performers or politicians appearing, where I've got a higher risk that's involved in that. So being proportional to your venue, your risk element to it. But I think that's where SafetyDocs is a huge advantage, because you're location specific, whether it's an event or a venue or a building, then that template becomes a methodology where people need to follow it and then need to fill it in. But because you've already done the definition of entry, exit points, you've walked it through, you've thought it through, and now you've got a template that's unique to that venue or building or event, that then forces people into thinking through the risk assessment as opposed to just applying it.
Yeah, no, brilliant. Yeah. Well, thank you, Keith. We've not got through all the questions, but we'll probably do this again to go through those.
Yeah.
Yeah, but a big thank you. It's been great to have you on, and a lot of the listeners will really value this. What we like about the podcasts is you can listen to them as you're driving around, so it's a great way of educating people without them actually being in a more relaxed situation.
Exactly.
Yeah, the book is Introduction to Crowd Science. We'll put the link and Keith's details on the episode description. And if you work anywhere near a crowd, buy it before your next event, not afterwards. Would you agree?
Of course, there was a sequel to Applied Crowd Science, which was published in 22 or so. And there's a free download of all of the case studies and examples that we've applied it to on the publisher's website. So I'll send you the link to that. You can maybe put it in your
Yeah,
podcast.
please do. Yeah.
Well, thanks very much for letting me to bleat on about my subject. You can understand I'm passionate about this. Spent more than half my life trying to, steer people in the right direction and developing tools and models, education and training programs to inform that. And I teach around the world, so still going strong.
No, it's wonderful. Well, wonderful to have your experience. So thanks again, Keith. So if today's episode's changed how you think about the documents sitting on your shelf or the complicated, expensive software that you're using, we'll share this with the person who signs them off, and we'll see you next time. So thank you, Keith.
Yeah, thank you, David. Cheers.
If you would like a free trial of SafetyDocs, please visit safetydocs.org.